Can a child's destiny be forever altered by cruel caregivers? Can innocence turn to horror due to abuse and neglect? This is exactly what happened to Edmund Kemper.
Why did you actually kill the girls?
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about that whole area, even if just sitting down and talking with a young lady.
As of 2024, Edmund Kemper's health has substantially deteriorated. He is now a wheelchair user due to a stroke and has been diagnosed with chronic conditions, including diabetes and coronary heart disease. A psychiatric evaluation conducted in April 2024 assessed him as being at a high risk of committing further offenses.
Necrophilia, cannibalism, and a desire to be caught. Ed Kemper did some heinous things to earn his incarceration, and now he doesn't want to leave prison.
Ed Kemper has been serving a life sentence in this California prison since 1973, when, at the age of 24, he murdered his mother, then called police and confessed to having dismembered college co-eds for 2 years, as well as cannibalizing.
His promising life was derailed by a troubled home that settled him on a catastrophic path. Born brilliant and sensitive, Kemper's story is heart-wrenching. A victim of childhood trauma, he became the notorious co-ed killer. His crimes shocked the nation, but what drove him to such horrors? Watch Kemper's story to understand how a broken childhood can lead to unimaginable horrors. How did he become the co-ed killer? Let's get in to find answers to the questions that haunt us all. Edmund Amir Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, to Edmund Kemper II and Clarnell Strandberg. Edmund deeply loved his father, who was a World War II veteran, but his relationship with his mother, Clarnell, was wild. Clarnell's overbearing nature created a toxic home environment, with Edmund's father comparing their relationship to a war zone. This dynamic stress would forever shape Edmund's life because it set the stage for the horrific crimes he would commit.
It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. See? I came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son. Is one of our arguments. I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse.
Edmund Kemper's father often joked that a suicide mission during World War II was preferable to living with his mother, Clarnell. Her severe and overly critical nature made life unbearable. She belittled her husband's job and refused to show affection to young Edmund because she believed it would make him gay. Clarnell constantly criticized and belittled her son and kept telling him no woman would ever love him.
A 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had.
Ed had been planning his mother's murder for a week. When she fell asleep, he seized the opportunity, hitting her with a hammer in her head repeatedly and decapitating her. He placed her head on a shelf, taunting her lifeless body by throwing darts at her head and mutilating her corpse. He did not stop here and cut out her larynx, disposed of it down the garbage disposal, and cited her constant belittling and criticizing as justification. After hiding the remaining parts of her body, Ed called his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, to come over. Upon her arrival, he strangled her to death, concealed her body in a closet, and left the note to the police. It read, approximately at 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I got things to do. Ed then cleaned up, got in his car, drove to Pueblo, Colorado, and listened intently to the radio for news of his mother's murder. When there was no mention of it, he pulled over and phoned the Santa Cruz Police Department and confessed to both murders. Initially, police were skeptical, but Ed's calm and detailed recounting of his crimes eventually led them to take him seriously. Officers were dispatched to his location, where they found Ed waiting by the payphone, and he was looking calm and composed. In 1957, Edmund's parents separated, which ended a loveless marriage, but the damage was done. Clarnell's toxic behavior had already taken a toll on Edmund's self-esteem and emotional well-being. This painful childhood set the stage for the dark path Edmund would later follow. After his parents' separation, Edmund's mother, Clarnell, moved him and his sisters to Montana. Edmund's father also moved to Los Angeles. Edmund disliked this move, and his relationship with her mother deteriorated further.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase. I watched her social life drop off. I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure.
Clarnell's growing alcoholism and constant criticism were increasing with time, which led to the development of dark fantasies in Edmund. As a child, Edmund engaged in disturbing games and playing dark. He convinced her sister to play with her games, such as gas chamber and electric chair, where he'd simulate his own death. He also took pleasure in disfiguring his sister's dolls, beheading and dismembering them.
And what were those games that you played with your sister?
Okay. Well, the one I remember someone talking about in a book was one that was playing gas chamber or electric chair or something. And we had this big old overstuffed chair up in my room. And it was not just my sister and I, it was my sister and I and a friend, a close friend. We got into all these games. We got into one game where we'd roll up in a rug and a person would try to get out of it. It's just like a large throw rug. And it was, I guess, what fascinated us individually about it is it was a completely, it broke up the monotony, I guess, of what we were doing. Didn't have a lot of toys to play with. We got bored with those pretty quickly. So we looked for things to do. You roll up in the rug and you try to get out, and the other two would leave the room and we see who could get out fastest. You know, you try to work your way out sideways or scoot out the end of it or whatever. And it went from that to being tied in this overstuffed chair with cord or something or pieces of sheet or sash or something. And it went through this process. I guess that's back in 1960 when Carol Chessman was executed.
These violent acts brought him a twisted sense of gratification and implanted a disturbing pattern in his young mind. Edmund's behavior grew increasingly troubled, which predicted the horrors he would later commit. The toxic dynamic with his mother had set him on a dangerous path and fueled his darkest impulses. As time passed, Edmund's fantasies turned into reality. This was evident when he became obsessed with his second-grade teacher and stalked her with a knife, which he had received from his father. His sisters teased him and asked why he didn't simply kiss her, and Edmund's response was horrific. "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first." At 10 years old, Edmund's thirst for violence intensified. He buried the family cat alive out of jealousy because he believed her sisters loved the cat more than him. But that wasn't enough. He dug it up, decapitated it, and displayed its head on a pike. He kept some bones in his closet. This was no longer just fantasy. Edmund was now acting on his dark impulses. The lines between reality and madness blurred, and the seeds of a serial killer were sown. The cat's brutal fate indicated the horrors Edmund would later inflict on human victims. His obsession with death and violence had become an unstoppable force and drove him down a dangerous path. Clarnell was scared of her son's strange behavior and worried he might harm his sisters. So, she made him sleep in the basement, away from the family.
At a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed, upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven.
At 13, Edmund killed another pet, just like he did before. The family's new pet met a gruesome end. He stabbed the pet with a knife. At 15, Ed fled to California to escape his toxic relationship with his mother. He sought refuge with his father, but his dad's new family didn't mesh with Ed's troubled nature. Realizing he couldn't handle Ed's issues, his father sent him back to his mother's house. However, this reunion was short-lived, and Ed was soon sent away again. And again, he was unable to find stability or support in his tumultuous home life. Rejected by his father, Ed was forced to live with his paternal grandparents on their 17-acre ranch in North York, California. Now a young man, Ed stood at an imposing 6 feet and 4 inches and weighed around 250 pounds. However, he soon discovered that his grandmother, Maud, was just as controlling as his mother, Clarnell, and he grew to resent every moment spent at the ranch.
But I got this domineering grandmother on my father's side. I got this domineering grandmother on my mother's side who died before I was born, but now she's reincarnated in my mother and her sister, my aunt. They're two very domineering, very aggressive, very successful women. Okay, so these two women are in terrible conflict with each other, competition, you know, and they didn't get along at all. All right, so I'm in the middle of that, trying to find my way, and I go stay with my dad, and I can only say he reflected back on his childhood and said, gee, I wish I'd been treated this way. So that's how he treated me and my stepbrother, and we responded to that.
The afternoon of August 27th, 1964, was a typical day for many. Ed's grandfather, Edmund I, took the family truck to run errands while Maud, a children's book author, sat at the kitchen table, reviewing and editing her work. But for Ed, this ordinary day would take a dark turn. That afternoon, Ed sat with Maud in the kitchen, but their tense relationship soon escalated into another argument. Fueled by anger, Ed grabbed his rifle, a Christmas gift from his grandfather for hunting pests on the farm. Claiming he was going outside to shoot gophers, Ed opened the kitchen screen door and then turned back. With his grandmother's back to him, immersed in her work, Ed gave in to a twisted impulse. He aimed the rifle at her head and pulled the trigger. Maud's lifeless body slumped forward onto the table. Ed fired 2 more shots into her back and ensured his heinous deed was complete. In a futile attempt to conceal his crime, Ed wrapped a towel around Maud's head, dragged her body to the bedroom, and hid the horrible evidence of his actions. Moments later, Ed's grandfather, Edmund, returned from the store, unaware of the horror that awaited him. As he unloaded groceries from the truck, Ed seized the opportunity, rifle in hand, and waited for his grandfather to turn around. Then, in a scary moment, Ed shot him dead. Overwhelmed by the gravity of his actions, he started panicking. With no apparent escape or alibi, he turned to the one person he could think of, his mother, Clarnell. She instructed him to call the police and confess to the atrocities he had committed. Ed followed her advice and calmly recounted his crimes to the authorities. After his unforgettable act, Ed walked to the front porch, with his emotions numb, and waited for the police to arrive. The devastating reality of his actions had set in, and he seemed resigned to face the consequences of his heinous crimes. During his police interrogation, when authorities asked him why he did this, he killed his grandmother simply to experience the feeling. When asked about his grandfather's murder, Ed claimed it was to spare him the trauma of discovering his wife's body. However, investigators later suspected that Ed's true motive was to avenge his father's rejection. Ed was arrested and transferred to the California Youth Authority, where he underwent extensive psychological evaluations. At just 15 years old, he demonstrated an exceptionally high IQ of 136, but also showed signs of paranoid schizophrenia. As a result, Ed was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital, which was a maximum security facility for convicts with mental illnesses. During his therapy sessions, Ed proved to be a quick learner and mastered what to say to appease his psychologists while secretly studying them. He treated his therapy like a classroom, becoming an assistant to the psychologists and gaining access to diagnostic materials. Ed thoroughly studied these materials and eventually convinced the doctors that he had recovered. The last report from his probation psychiatrists read, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative and intelligence and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses." It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation. I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society. And, since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. Unaware to them, Ed hid dark fantasies and developed a fascination with the stories of conquest shared by fellow patients. He skillfully concealed these aspects of his personality and manipulated the system to his advantage. In 1969, at just 21 years old, Ed Kemper was considered recovered by the doctors at Atascadero State Hospital, despite recommendations that he not be returned to his mother's care due to persistent psychological issues. Ed was released back into Clarnell's custody. Clarnell, now an administrator at the University of California in Santa Cruz, used her influence to secure Ed a job. He briefly attended community college classes, but his desire for freedom led him to abandon both pursuits. Ed drifted through various jobs until landing a position with the Department of Transportation in 1971. His fascination with firearms and law enforcement grew, prompting him to apply to become a state trooper. Ed's dreams of becoming a police officer were short-lived due to his grand size. Yet he wasn't discouraged, and he befriended officers at a local bar and earned the nickname Big Ed. His charm and friendly demeanor even helped him have a police-issued training badge and occasional access to a gun. A motorcycle accident in 1971 left Ed with a severely injured arm and unable to work. However, a successful lawsuit yielded a $15,000 settlement, which he used to buy a car. With his newfound freedom and financial security, Ed's darker impulses began to surface. Ed took to driving around the campus where his mother worked. He noticed an increasing number of young women hitchhiking to and from their destinations. As he watched them, his interest and desire grew. He prepared his car by placing handcuffs and a knife in the trunk and tucking a gun beneath his seat. Then, he began picking up hitchhikers. Ed used initial encounters as learning experiences to refine his approach with each new hitchhiker. He learned how to engage with the women, how to speak to them, and how to make them believe he meant no harm. Despite his sinister intentions, Ed was personable and charismatic, able to gain people's trust, and even charm them convincingly. However, with each day that passed, and another hitchhiker slipped through his grasp, Ed's eagerness to fulfill his darkest desires intensified. Finally, the day arrived when he felt ready to take the next step. On a quiet morning in early May, Ed spotted two young women, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, who were looking for a ride in the Berkeley area. They willingly climbed into the back seat of his car, unaware of the danger that awaited them. Ed Kemper's victims, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, were Fresno State students, hitchhiking back to the Stanford University campus. After driving for a while, Ed pulled off the highway and down a secluded dirt road not far from Alameda with the intention of assaulting the girls in private. He stopped the car, handcuffed Marianne to the back seat, and chased after Anita, who tried to escape into the woods. Ed caught up to her, stabbed her repeatedly, and strangled her to death. Covered in her blood, he returned to the car and convinced Marianne to get out and claimed he needed her help. However, he overpowered her, stabbed her, and left her to bleed out in the trunk alongside Anita's body. Ed then drove back to his home, decapitated the bodies, removed their hands, and assaulted the corpses. He took Polaroid photos as trophies, allowing him to relive the crime. The parents of the girls filed a missing persons report, but nothing was clear until August 1972, when Mary Ann's head and body parts were found scattered along the Loma Prieta mountain. Anita's remains were never found. Ed Kemper had now finally acted on his fantasies, but the satisfaction was short-lived. He wanted more, and he would get it. Ed's craving for violence and control had only intensified since his previous victims. Just a few months later, on a warm day in September 1972, he spotted Ikoku had grown tired of waiting for the bus. She decided to hitchhike to dance class instead. Iko, a naive and impressionable 15-year-old, climbed into the front seat of Edmund Kemper's car when he pulled up alongside her. As they drove along the highways, Ed pulled a gun on Iko and shoved it between her ribs, insisting he didn't want to hurt her. He claimed he tried to take his own life and just wanted someone to talk to. Ed convinced Iko to let him tie her up and gag her, and then pulled over to secure her mouth with tape. Ed then told Iko to get into the back seat and put the gun under his seat. However, he locked himself out of the car and had to convince Iko to open the door for him. As soon as she did, Ed began to strangle her. Iko fought back, but Ed overpowered her, assaulted her, and strangled her with her scarf. Ed placed Aiko's body in the trunk of his car and, hot and sweaty from the fight, decided to go to a bar for a few drinks. Later that night, he brought Aiko's body to his home and dismembered it. Ed took his depravity even further by freezing and eating parts of his victims, claiming it was an experiment. He threw their body parts into the mountains of Santa Cruz. On a rainy evening on January 8, 1972, Cynthia Shaw, an experienced hitchhiker, was making her way down Mission Road near the university campus. Ed Kemper was eager to try out his new .22 Ruger, so he spotted her and offered a ride. He pulled off to a secluded area, forced her out, and ended her life with a single shot to the head. Ed stuffed her body into the trunk, drove home, and hid it in a closet until his mother left. Then, he assaulted and dismembered the corpse, keeping her head in his room. He drove along the coast, throwing out body parts, and buried her head in the yard beneath his mother's window. By this time, police were aware of dozens of missing hitchhikers and college students, but they had no suspects. Two other serial murderers, John Linley Frazier and Herbert Mullins, were active in the same area, which even complicated the investigation. Campus security warned students to avoid cars without a campus sticker, but Ed already had one, given to him by his mother. On another rainy evening, on February 5, 1973, Ed picked up the two strangers and drove towards the edge of campus. It was the campus sticker that reassured Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu into a false sense of security when Ed pulled up on campus and offered them a ride. As they took in the sights of Santa Cruz, Ed slowed the car to a crawl and pulled out the gun he had hidden beneath his leg. He shot Rosalind in the back of the head and quickly fired 3 more rounds into Allison Liu. Ed later admitted that he could still hear Allison dying in the back seat as he drove past campus security and rode away into the night. As with all his other victims, Ed shared in his usual gruesome rituals, but the effects no longer excited him. It had become a routine. Ed's life as he knew it came to a tumultuous end when he got into another heated argument with his mother, Clarnell. She left the house to attend a party, leaving Ed stewing in anger. When Clarnell returned home, she fell asleep, prompting Ed to take action. May 7, 1973, marked a significant turning point in the case of Edmund Kemper, the notorious co-ed killer, as he was accused on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Edmund Kemper's crimes, typically involved necrophilia, decapitation, and dismemberment, and left horror and devastation behind. His counsel, Jim Jackson, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and cited Kemper's detailed confession. As the trial approached, Kemper's mental state became increasingly unstable. He attempted suicide twice while in custody. He highlighted the depths of his chaos. On October 23, 1973, the trial began, and 3 court-appointed psychiatrists testified that Kemper was legally sane. Dr. Joel Fort's investigation revealed Kemper's engagement in cannibalism, cooking, and consuming flesh from his victims. However, Kemper later denied this confession. Under California's Manhattan standard, Kemper was deemed aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. On November 1, 1973, Kemper took the stand and confessed he killed victims to possess them. He claimed 2 personalities inhabited his body, with a killer personality taking over. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury declared Kemper sane and guilty on all counts on November 8, 1973. When asked about his sentence, Kemper replied, "I should be tortured to death." However, due to the state's recent repeal of capital punishment, he received 8 consecutive life sentences. Instead of the death penalty, Kemper was sentenced to 7 years to life for each count, to be served concurrently due to a moratorium on capital punishment imposed by the California Supreme Court. Edmund has spent decades in prison. Despite his dark past, he's become a model prisoner. Kemper has found new purpose in prison. He narrates audiobooks for the visually impaired and crafts ceramic cups. These activities show a different side of him. However, his openness about his crimes has been a double-edged sword. While he hopes to help others, it hasn't swayed the parole board. Kemper has been denied parole multiple times, with his next chance coming in 2031. Meanwhile, a recent evaluation has classified him as a high risk to reoffend. This raises questions about his ability to change. Can someone who has committed such heinous crimes truly redeem themselves? Edmund Kemper's parole history spans multiple decades. Beginning with his first eligibility in 1979, he was denied parole, a decision repeated in subsequent hearings in 1980, 1981, and 1982. In 1985, Kemper waived his right to a hearing. Kemper's next parole hearing was in 1988, where he stated, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." Prosecutors echoed this sentiment at future hearings, citing the enormity of his crimes as a reason for denial. Kemper was denied parole again in 1991, 1994, and 2007. He ignored his right to a hearing in 1997 and 2002, but attended the 2012 hearing, where he was denied parole once more. In 2017, Kemper was denied parole again and declined to attend the 2024 hearing, resulting in another denial. His next eligibility date is set for 2031.